Hey everybody, welcome to the latest episode of the Rock Experience with Mike Brunn. On this episode, I'm really excited to welcome back to the show author Greg Prato. We're going to discuss his newest books, A-plus albums, as well as iconic guitar gear. We'll also cover some of the Kiss books he's written in the past, and so much more. If you love rock music, I guarantee you're going to love this conversation. We cover it all from the 70s, 80s, 90s, and more. This is a lot of fun. I think you guys are going to really enjoy it. Alrighty, lots to cover in this episode, so why don't we jump in and let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome to the latest episode of the Rock Experience with Mike Brunn. Today I'm excited to have back with me, I think it's the third time, maybe the fourth, but definitely the third time, Greg, you've been on. Welcome back to the show.
Hey Mike, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about the Kiss books in a little bit, but I know obviously Kiss fans have seen you on my show. You've written a bunch of Kiss books, a couple of Kiss books, but you've also written a bunch of other books, and we'll talk about some of them today. So before we get into the details of talking about your newest books, how many books have you actually written at this point?
30 something. I've actually lost count, to be honest with you. And it's not because I'm bragging, just I honestly have lost count, to be honest with you. I've done music books and I've done a few sports books as well. People that watch your show probably know me best for the Eric Carr story, was an earlier book I did, and also the Take It Off, Kiss, Truly Unmasked book was also, I think that was, I was probably interviewed both those times. I think that, yes, this is my third appearance, I believe.
You actually helped and appeared as well when we did a tribute to Eric Carr for his 70th birthday.
Right. Yep. I forgot about that.
Yeah, which was really cool.
These are the two books I'm talking about, in case anyone forgot: the Eric Carr story and also Take It Off, Kiss, Truly Unmasked.
Which is two great books. Any Kiss fan that doesn't have them, stop watching right now, pause, come back in a moment, but first go order those two books. So they're both great.
And they're also they're both available as audiobooks, and they are narrated by me, if you could believe that. That's
awesome. That's absolutely awesome. And we'll talk about where people can buy all of the books in a little bit. But one of the things I love, and I'm glad you mentioned it, you haven't done just music books. You did some sports books. I think there's a couple of books on the Islanders, which is the team I grew up loving. Yep. And I think you got some books on the Mets and the Yankees as well. It's a lot of the New York sports scene as well, I guess.
Yeah, I did two books about the Jets, one book about the Yankees, one book about the Mets, and one book about the Islanders. The Islanders one is called Dynasty. That's a pretty popular one because I interviewed all the people that were part of the Dynasty. And the Jets, I have one called Sack Exchange, which is about the 80s Jets, and another one which counts down the top 100 biggest blunders of all time by the Jets, because there's many of those.
I was going to say you could limit that to 100.
Yeah, I was going to say that could be about two or three volumes, I think.
I think so. With that, now, how do you decide on your topics when you're writing books?
Every single book I've ever done has been a topic that I was a fan of the thing before, and it was a book I wanted to read. The only book that I was asked to do, and I accepted because I was a fan of them, I did a book about Pearl Jam. There was a series called, it's like 100 Things Pearl Jam fans should do before they die. And it's a series. They do it like with all different rock bands and sports teams and everything. And they contacted me and they asked me to do it. And I was definitely all for it because, like I said, I've been a longtime Pearl Jam fan. And I did an earlier book. One of my first books was called Grunge is Dead, which was a chronicle of the whole grunge scene. And I interviewed Jeff Ament and also Eddie Vedder, which is still to this day one of the top interviews I've ever done. I did two very extensive interviews with both of them for that book. So, of course, I said yes to doing a book about Pearl Jam afterwards.
Of course. And that's another thing I want to bring up here before we jump into some of your new books, is that you've written 30 plus books, like you said. You've also had a lot of interviews published in different publications, Guitar World, I mean, you name it, right? You've had tons of interviews published as well.
Yeah, and it's funny. In like the last 2 weeks, I actually landed two of my biggest interviews. I interviewed Dave Mustaine from Megadeth, who I've interviewed before, but this one was pretty good because he was very candid. He talked about why he did not allow Metallica to do a box set that was going to include him in it earlier, and he was very, very candid about why it was all about money pretty much, and also he couldn't iron out like the whole publishing agreement. So he talked about that. He also, which I didn't know, he said that supposedly Lars Ulrich was the person that wrote the Master of Puppets riff. I never knew that before.
Mm-hmm.
So that was pretty cool. Yeah, that was an interview for the website called Song Facts. And then I also, the same maybe 2 days either before or after, I interviewed David Crosby from Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and that was a great interview because again he was very candid. I asked him what his relationship is currently with the other members of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and sadly the only one that he still speaks to is Stephen Stills. He says his relationship with Graham Nash and Neil Young is quote unquote non-existent, which was kind of sad to hear.
That is sad to hear. And that's one of the things I love about your work is that it really runs the gamut of rock. It's not just focused on 80s or 70s. Kiss fans, like you said, know you for the two Kiss books, which, centers on the 80s. But like you just said, whether it's Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, whether it's Pearl Jam, and that's one of the things I love about your books. It kind of runs the gamut of all different eras of music.
Yeah, I listen to everything. To be honest, when I eat dinner at night, I'm usually listening to either Frank Sinatra or tonight I listen to Dave Brubeck, if you could believe that.
Nice, very nice. Now, what was the first book you ever wrote?
The first one was A Devil on One Shoulder and an Angel on the Other, which was about Shannon Hoon and also Blind Melon, which is a singer and band that I am to this day, one of my all-time favorites. I know that Blind Melon gets a bad rap. A lot of people think they were just a one-hit wonder because the song No Rain, but there's a lot more to that band. I was lucky to have discovered them early on, and I saw them 5 times with Shannon Hoon, and to this day, he's still one of my favorite performers, singers, lyricists. Their second album called Soup, which came out in 1995, doesn't get the credit it deserves. It's kind of developed a cult following over the years, but when it first came out, it didn't sell nearly as well as their first album, which was one that had the song No Rain on it. Right. But the album Soup, if you forced me to pick one favorite album of all time, I would probably pick that album, if you could believe that.
Really? Well,
that's an album that I could still listen to today, and I've been listening to pretty regularly since 1995. I never get sick of it. It's just fantastic. I mean, what's sad about it is, and I learned this from also the book I did, is I think, Shannon Hoon obviously had a lot of problems. He had demons with substance abuse and drinking and stuff, and I think also manic depression. And you could tell that sadly he knew that I think that the end was going to be coming soon for him. Mm-hmm. Similar maybe to what Lane Staley did on the last few Alice in Chains albums. Yep. So the lyrics throughout the songs in Soup are very, they're very kind of diary-esque, and he definitely didn't pull any punches. So yeah. I still do miss Shannon Hoon. I wish he was still with us just for for me, I just wish I would have seen what he was going to do next, because I think that band was really entering a very interesting phase with that album Soup.
Absolutely. That's one of the things I love about, discussions like this. So here it is, you're mentioning that's your favorite album, perhaps of all time. And if I could, I could ask 1,000 other people and not one person may mention that album. They mention maybe 1,000 different albums, which kind of leads us to one of your latest books, right? Yes. Which is A+ albums, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Right?
Exactly.
So just talk about the premise behind what these books are.
Well, so if you put them together, it's almost like a little puzzle, isn't it? You see that?
That is cool, which obviously means that it's required to have both of them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and also I made it a point to keep these very competitively priced. They're only $14.99 each for paperback,
which is incredible.
Yes, because I know times are kind of tight with people with money, so why not give some people a decent deal? You know what I'm saying?
At $14.99, I mean, I think about it. I bought a pizza last night for more money than that. So for $14.99, to me, that's a steal. But just talk a little bit about what the books are, and then we'll go, dig into them a little bit more.
Sure, yeah, definitely. What it is, as you said, I write for a bunch of websites and magazines. I write for Song Facts, Guitar World, Vintage Guitar, a bunch of different places. And I realized about maybe a year ago that I've done a lot of articles that kind of told the stories behind albums, and also some of my past books. I've done books on Soundgarden. I already talked about Blind Melon. And in those books, I pretty much go inside albums and kind of, or at least I had quotes about that album. So I realized I had a pretty good starting point if I were to do an album kind of show, kind of spotlight. So I realized if I compiled the ones I already did for previous outlets, and then also did a bunch of new ones as well for albums that I love that I just never covered, I put them all together, I was able to whittle it down to 50 that cover, in the volume 1 covers 1970 through 1982, and the second volume covers 1982 through 2000. Yep. And each one, each album, what it is I tried to select albums that I could put an interesting quote from someone that I've interviewed either for this book or previously, because I've done so many interviews over the years. So I was trying to not just give you the not the run of the mill kind of thing that you'd expect with just me analyzing the album, but each entry includes it does include me talking about the album, analyzing it a bit. Also some quotes from people somehow either related to the album or that are celebrities that are also very big fans of the album. So they're kind of giving their own 2 cents about that album. And then also just things about how the album holds up, chart positions, if it went gold or platinum or whatever, and just trying to keep some interesting, trying to put some interesting things and some interesting spins on it. I also try to include some albums that you would expect, balancing between albums you would expect and albums you would not expect. And I also was able to get a lot of really cool pictures for these books. Like here's some classic Van Halen photos from back in 1980.
Amazing.
And I have some Cheap Trick. Remember the band Cheap Trick? Of course you do, Mike, right?
I've heard of them once or twice. They had that hit song in the 80s, The Flame, I think, right? A one-hit wonder?
Yeah, right, exactly. And of course, the late, great, and of course we have Rush, we have the late, great Neil Peart, which I still pronounce his name Peart. I know everyone says Peart because like about 20 years ago, I think Geddy Lee in concert started to say on drums Neil Peart, and then suddenly everyone stopped saying Peart. They said Peart, but I'm sticking with Peart. I don't care what anyone says.
Me too. Me too. I'm with you on that one. Now, let me ask you, because like you said, it's 2 volumes, and the first one only covers the 12 years, 70 to 82, yet it's 50 selections. And my first thought was, how in the world do you narrow down those 12 years to only 50 A+ albums? You might be able to find 50 per year. How do you go about going through that process?
Yeah, it was a little bit, again, it was like kind of like a weighing process. There were certain bands and albums I knew I had to include. Like I had to include the Beatles, Black Sabbath, Jimi Hendrix. Those just absolutely had to be included. But then it was also an opportunity for me to also shed some light on some albums that I think are really just phenomenal classics that maybe don't get the attention, such as Funkadelic Maggot Brain. That was a fantastic funk rock album, which is kind of like Jimi Hendrix, but it's even heavier than Jimi Hendrix. That was from 1971, which I think is a fantastic album. That was a huge influence on what would become the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Right.
I actually discovered that album because in 1989, 1990, I was reading interviews with the Chili Peppers, and Flea, the bassist, was really going on about that album, and I tracked down a copy and was absolutely blown away.
Right.
So I included that. I also included one of my favorite all-time live albums, which is Thin Lizzy Live and Dangerous. I think that's a highly, highly underrated live album. So I made sure I included that. But then by the same token, I had to include the Eagles Hotel California because I had to be included the First Ramones, included the Sex Pistols, Never Mind the Bollocks.
I was happy to see that on the list.
Yeah. And then also things that, what's kind of funny is even though I'm from Long Island, I was never really a huge Billy Joel fan growing up, but over maybe the last 5, 6, 7 years, I've kind of got a new appreciation for him. I was able to see him a couple of times live, and I was really impressed. He still puts on a fantastic show, and also seeing him live, it really is impressive how many hits he's had over the years. I mean, there's very few artists that can rival how many classics he's, and I think he's penned them all pretty much by himself.
Yeah,
to the best of my knowledge. And he, still sounds great, still sings great, plays great. So I was able to do the album Glass Houses. That's my entry, and a little bit of everything. I have the album Double Fantasy from John Lennon and also Yoko Ono. I have the Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden. That absolutely had to be included, right?
Right. And that's, I'll just pause you from them. That's one of the things I love. I mean, I know the first book starts with the first Black Sabbath album, right? But then just think of the different types of genres of music. I mean, it's all in the rock spectrum, but think about the different bands you just mentioned and how different they are from each other. And that's what I love about a book like this. It's not just like the 50 hard rock albums or the 50 pop albums or the 50 psychedelic albums or the 50 Beatles songs or albums, whatever. It's really, there's something there for everybody. But I got to ask you one question here, and I hope you don't mind this, Greg.
Go ahead.
I'm reading through the book, and I hate to ask this question today of all days, because I don't know if you heard, but Christine McVie passed away,
Yes.
and that was announced. And I'm like, I am shocked. I believe Rumors was not in the book as one of the
It was not, yeah,
50
because
April. And I'm like, how did you leave? And I thought this before today. I put it in
right.
my notes. I was like, I got to ask him why that album is not in there, because that was the only one. I'm like, all right, taking my own bias out. How could that not be there?
Yeah, there's certain albums that I was considering including, but again, I really was trying to not just give you like a standard kind of like Rolling Stone-esque just list of albums and include just the expected albums. And the reason why an album like, for instance, Rumors was not included is because, for the simple reason, I've never interviewed anyone from Fleetwood Mac, so I couldn't really put any kind of interesting spin, because I didn't want it to be just the same old. There were these two sets of boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, and wife, and they broke up, and that's been analyzed to death with Fleetwood Mac. I mean, of course, I am a Fleetwood Mac fan, but just like, for instance, I did also not include a Bruce Springsteen album, which I'm getting a little bit of criticism from.
Okay.
I'm getting a little bit of criticism.
See, I didn't mind that one because I never but I can understand people making comments. How can you not include Born to Run or Born in the USA? I understand that.
Right. But now I will give a little bit of a surprise away, because I know there's a lot of Kiss fans listening to this, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so with Kiss, you'd expect probably the entries to be Alive and probably say Destroyer, right?
Right. Yep.
Instead, I went with Kiss, the first album, because to me, that's one of the most underrated rock debuts of all time. That album never gets the credit it deserves, I think, because from beginning to end, that album, I think, is pretty much great. I mean, the cover of Kiss in Time is a little iffy, but
it wasn't on the original press, so we could just exclude it if we want.
Right? Exactly. So that was included, and then the other Kiss album I included, I went all the way to 82 with Creatures of the Night, because that album, again, never got the credit it deserved. Although, I mean, again, similar to Blind Melon Soup, over the years, it's developed a whole cult following, and I think it has kind of finally eventually gotten the credit that it deserves, because that album was just the sound of Kiss being completely reborn, which is funny. You and I had a similar experience with that album. You said you did not care for it when you first heard it.
It's great that you remember that. That's exactly true. When it first came out, I was, for whatever reason, I just didn't connect with the album. Go figure. I connected with The Elder as a 10-year-old kid, but not Creatures of the Night. So I don't know what was wrong with me at that age, but I did not connect with Creatures at first.
Well, what's funny is you didn't connect with it. I merely just completely ignored it.
But maybe in some ways that's better, because people can say, how could Brunn not have connected with that album? It's so great. But I just didn't, as a 12-year-old kid at the time.
Yeah, because what happened was, at that time, my two favorite bands were Kiss and Queen. Still to this day, my favorite all-time band is Queen. I'll just put it out there right now. But
nothing wrong with that.
Sadly, 1981-ish, 1982 was just brutal for Kiss and Queen, with The Elder and then Hot Space from Queen, which were the two of their worst albums, I think, from both bands. And it just totally took the wind out of my sails with Kiss. And even Queen, I was a huge fan of Queen. And then after that album, it just kind of killed it for me for a while. And then eventually I got really back into Queen circa The Miracle, which was 1989. And then they became my favorite band again. And then Kiss, I eventually got, what happened with Kiss, I got back into a lot sooner, because through Lick It Up, I became really big into them again. And then I went back. So it was in 1983 that I finally went back and listened to Creatures of the Night, and I was blown away.
So let me ask you then, if you're forced to listen to one of those 1981 albums, is it Kiss or Queen?
Oh, man. Can I go with a draw? Because they're both, I mean, you see what it is. I mean, honestly, both albums, it's not like that they're totally unlistenable. I mean, Kiss, at least it's the sound of Kiss getting heavy again, but it's just the material is just so off par. And then, like most Kiss fans, it's always in the back of my mind, I'm thinking they should just listen to what Ace Frehley was saying.
Absolutely.
At that point, just do a heavy album. That album could have potentially been Creatures, and then also with Queen, the album Hot Space, if you listen to the sound of that album compared to the previous previous two studio albums, which was The Game and also the Flash Gordon soundtrack, they're both, I believe, produced by a gentleman named Mac. And then he produced the album Hot Space, and it's just such an awful sounding production-wise, sonically album. It's like very tinny and trebly, whereas The Game is, to this day, one of my favorite sounding productions. It's a huge sounding production. That's the album that has, of course, Another One Bites the Dust on it. And that's I mean, if you love or hate that song, it doesn't matter. You have to admit that that's a great sounding song as far as sonics go.
Yep.
So I'll have to go with a two-way mediocre tie with that.
Well, maybe for your next set of books, you need to do the D+ albums, and you can include those in there. There it is, your new idea, the D plus
There
albums,
you go.
volume
There
one and
you
two.
go.
So let me ask you, when you're putting these lists together
Mm.
of all these different albums, do you try to keep your personal bias out? How do you keep your personal bias? Do you want to even keep your personal bias out? What's your process of going through the thoughts like that?
Yeah, I do keep it out a bit. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest Guns N' Roses fan. I was a fan of theirs when Appetite for Destruction first came out. No one really knew about them.
Same here.
And then it was like one of those things where they became really popular. Then I just got sick of them and I just stopped listening to them. And then, I wasn't a big fan of Axl's Hijinks. That just not for me. And then, after Appetite for Destruction, I honestly there's not another song after that album that I really like from Guns N' Roses, if I'm going to be totally honest.
Okay.
I'm just not, but I had to include Appetite for Destruction because it was just such a complete game changer. It almost was similar to what actually Nirvana Nevermind did in 1991. That it was the sound of a real raw rock band at the time, which went totally against, if you think about what was popular when Appetite for Destruction came out, which was like Poison, Cinderella, all the hair metal things. So anyways, what I did is I did include that album, but I explained at the beginning that I have a love-hate relationship with it because just if I never again in my life ever hear Welcome to the Jungle, Sweet Child of Mine, or Paradise City again, I'd actually die a very happy man, because it's just, I mean, how many times can you hear those same songs on the radio, at sporting events? Sadly, it's the same way that actually the song Rock and Roll All Night has become for me. If I never hear that song again, I'd be very happy. It just, you can only hear these songs so many times.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I know. I'm glad you just now mentioned Nirvana, right? Because that's a band that really polarizes a lot of rock fans. There's people who love Nirvana. There's people that absolutely hate everything that Nirvana stood for, hate that it kind of took away all the music from the 80s. But I happen to be in the camp that even back then, I loved Nirvana, and I don't see them as that far off from somebody like, let's say, Black Sabbath type music or whatever. So I grew up loving Nirvana and still do to this day. But I love that you highlight in the book that Nevermind is not their debut album.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And you even acknowledge, and it's in the book, that their first album, Bleach, that you have listed there as well. So, I love that you have both of those in the book.
Yeah, I was debating, should it be Bleach or should it be In Utero? And I went with Bleach because I did a pretty good extensive interview with the drummer on that album, which is Chad Channing.
Yeah,
is his name. That's the drummer that, of course, Dave Grohl wound up replacing in the band. Yep. And I got some pretty good stories about that. He talks about how he was the one that came up with the title About a Girl and how he came up with that. And he also talked about the first Nirvana album, Bleach, is a very heavy sounding album. Everything is totally detuned, which at the time there weren't those many heavy metal rock bands that were actually detuning. It wasn't until maybe a little bit later that a lot of bands started doing that again, especially with like the stoner metal bands and things like that. But like Soundgarden and also Nirvana were probably the bands at that point that started detuning, and then later in the 90s that became pretty much accepted. But yeah, the album Bleach is a classic. I absolutely love that album.
Oh, I love the song Negative Creep is right up there to me, is one of their best songs. So I love that album.
One of my favorite Nirvana songs was not even a original song. It was the cover of the song called Love Buzz. I love that song.
Oh yeah. I love that song. Yeah, no, yeah. Both albums to me are great. So I love that they were included. Now for you, and we spoke a little bit about like the different types of music you listen to. Growing up as a kid, were you into like the hair metal scene? We spoke a little bit about the grunge scene right now. What was the music that you grew up listening to?
I mean, at
Queen
the time,
and Kiss, obviously.
Yeah, at the time, if you asked me, I would say I hate hair metal. But I mean, at the time, when I was a teenager, I really just listened to heavy metal. Kiss was my favorite band for most of me being a teenager. Then when I was about 17, I went back to Queen being my favorite band, and that still remains true to this day. But around like 1989, 1990, I started listening to other styles of music. I remember the gateway into me listening to other styles of music was the Police. I just woke up one day in 1989. I was like, I'd like to listen to Zenyatta Mandata. And I went out and I bought that, and I was absolutely blown away. And then from there, I started going back listening to like new wave, and then I got into funk music, jazz, prog rock, punk. Now I listen to pretty much everything. So to answer your question, if I am a hair metal fan, there's no genre of music I could say I completely like. I have a rule which I live to by this day, that every genre has its good bands and also bad bands.
So true.
So yeah. So as far as hair metal, to this day, I think the first Motley Crue album was pretty good. I love David Lee Roth, Even Smile. Is that considered even a hair metal album? No, I don't even know if that is.
It depends on who you ask. I don't consider it a hair metal, but some people say
Right.
Van Halen were responsible for ushering in the hair
Right.
metal
Yeah.
scene.
Yeah.
So it depends who you
Exactly.
ask, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
And now let me ask you another question. Is Appetite for Destruction a hair metal album?
I always say yes, and I'll tell you
I
why.
think so too.
Go
But
back and
yeah, you
look
can
at
explain.
that first video that they did and look at some
Yes.
of their early promo
Yeah.
pictures. I mean, they're
Mhm.
glammed up big time. They have just as much makeup almost as Poison on, right? During some of
Yeah.
those
Exactly.
pictures. So, but they quickly dropped it. So, and like you, I actually bought Appetite for Destruction before the album took off. I bought it with
Yep.
the original album cover, not even
Oh
the
wow.
cross modes, right? So I literally have the original album cover, purchased it in Manhattan simply because I had gone to a battle of the bands with a friend of mine, and this band did Welcome to the Jungle. Had no idea what song it was. Like, that sounded good. The next day I happened to be in a record store, and the guy's like, this album cover is being banned. So instantly as a kid, I'm like, ooh, this is gonna be valuable. I'm buying it. And I turn around, I look and I see Welcome to the Jungle. I'm like, that's the song that band played last night. I'm gonna buy it. And I swear on my life, me and my friend Vinny bought the album the same day. I went home and I said to him, I said, what do you think of it? He's like, it's okay. I'm like, it's okay. This is friggin' great. I said, do
Yeah.
you hear that song, Sweet Child of Mine? I've
Mm.
never heard a guitar introduction like that.
Mm.
Fast forward 30 years later, I kind of feel like you now. I'm like, if I
Yeah.
never hear that damn song again,
Right.
that's okay with me. But when I bought that album in that moment, again, the original press of that album, I was blown away.
You know, I could tell they were going to be huge, and it actually relates to Kiss. Would you like to hear another Kiss related story?
Of course. Why don't I always want to hear a Kiss related story?
Actually, to tell you, it'll fit into this era because it's a non-makeup Kiss story.
All right, there you go.
So it was in January 1988. I went to see Kiss at Nassau Coliseum on the Crazy Nights tour.
Yep.
Ted Nugent opening.
Ted Nugent. Yep.
Yes. After Ted Nugent's done playing, me and my friend are sitting there, and they're playing songs between the two bands while they're breaking it down and setting up Kiss's stuff. They played, I remember, Heartbreaker from, of course, Led Zeppelin, and the crowd claps, everyone's into it. Then they played Welcome to the Jungle, and it was almost as if Guns N' Roses was there. The whole arena started like cheering.
And this was late
crazy.
January of '88, I believe that
January of
was.
1988.
Yep.
Yeah. Did I say 1987?
No. I think you said 88, but I'm just timelining it for people. It's literally January of 80. I think like January 25th, if I remember right, for some stupid reason. Anyway,
I'm pretty sure it was towards the end of January.
I think it was January 25th, if I remember right, for some stupid reason. Anyway, go ahead.
So I mean, after that, and like to this day, I've never really experienced that before. That just a band being played between the actual two the opening and also headlining band. I've never experienced that to this day at any other show. So at that point, I really did kind of get the idea. All right, this band is going to be huge soon. And it seemed like just a few weeks later, that's when they were all over MTV. And then by the summer, they were like the biggest band.
Right. It's funny that you say that. You're making me remember. And we were talking before about some of the grunge bands and all of that. I used to record some concerts when I went to them. Shh.
Wait.
Don't tell nobody.
What's that? Say it again.
I said I used to record some concerts on audio tape. But shh, don't tell nobody.
Okay.
So anyway, I was at a Kick show, and I was just last year listening to one of my recordings. It was like from late 91 or early 92. And I'm at this Kick show, and I recorded the show. And at the end, I just left the tape, playing while I was walking out. And in the background, you hear Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I was like, well, that's pretty wild, because here it is, all of these hair metal bands, started to hate Nirvana because they thought it was like the death knell for them. But here it is, I'm at a Kicks concert, which, they were kind of a hair metal band, you know, and here it is at the end of their show. What are they playing? Nirvana, right? And it just, to me, it reinforced how at that time, nobody thought like separate genres. It's just like, it's a good song or not a good song. On my tape, you could hear some people like singing along to the song as we're walking out or whatever. And that's why, as you're saying this with like the Guns N' Roses thing, I instantly thought back to that with my Kicks show and people singing along to Nirvana. That's just the way it was. Good music is good music, is in my mind,
I agree. And then also probably if you think back to what Headbangers Ball was playing in late 99 and throughout 92, they would play Pantera, they would play Guns N' Roses, they would play Soundgarden, Nirvana. Eventually, they started playing stuff like Sepultura and Prong. So it was like a big mashup of everything. Which
absolutely.
Now,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and like that to me, I think is the best thing to listen to a wide variety of not just heavy metal, but listen to all different styles of music. But I may have brought this up in one of my previous appearances, but the thing I miss most concerning hard rock and also heavy metal was from the early to mid 90s, it seemed like every single band that was new and coming up put their own unique spin on it. Whereas now you could pretty much pinpoint every single new heavy metal band borrows from Metallica, Iron Maiden, and also Pantera. You can actually pinpoint like here's the Phil Anselmo growl, here's the Iron Maiden harmony guitar harmony part, here's the riff type down pick thing from James Hetfield and Metallica. Yep. It's just way too it's just too cookie cutter for me. Again, I don't know if it's because I'm a complete old fart now and it's just or what, but I mean, do you also get the sense, Mike, or no?
Yeah, I try very hard not to be the old fart you just mentioned, and having two younger kids helps to some degree, although my kids are now 24 and 19, so they're not young anymore. But I was joking with my daughter, her two favorite bands, more from like the last 15 years or so, and those bands are My Chemical Romance and Paramore. And I joke with her that I am the one that actually got into both of those bands. Paramore, because we saw No Doubt and Paramore opened, and I downloaded some songs for her. And My Chemical Romance, I actually was into My Chemical Romance back in 2010 or so. So I was telling somebody just recently, to go back to your question, I listen to new music, and I mentioned those two bands, and then it dawns on me, both of them are like 15 years old. There's nothing new about that. That they are as old now as like I used to think in the late 80s when I was listening to Kiss and I was listening to like the first Kiss album that was ancient. Well, this new music I'm listening to is just as old as that Kiss album was for me in 1989. So it's really not all that new anymore. But I agree for the most part. I hate to say it, a lot of the new music doesn't appeal to me, but maybe it's just I'm becoming an old fart. I don't know.
And then also something that's very obvious. I'm sure you've also noticed this as well, that bands like Kiss and Aerosmith and Rush, even Springsteen, were given 3 or 4 albums to slowly build their fan base. Whereas now, if you don't have a hit right away, you're dropped and you're just totally gone. So that's also probably why I guess they're just taking the like easy way out, these bands, just so that if another band comes out that sounds like Metallica, there's at least a shot that it's going to get some kind of notice. Whereas if you sound completely different, it may take a while for people to catch on. So
no, going back to your book, then think about how many albums are in your book, and you're not going to know the answer to this, but how many albums are in your book that if they were released today, you said like the first Kiss album, the debut album, that did not sell well when it first came out, right?
No, and also I included the first Blue Oyster Cult album, which I think is a great classic album, and that album didn't do well either. And it also took Blue Oyster Cult a few albums to slowly build up. So
absolutely. So think about if those kind of bands and those albums were released today, they'd probably fall by the wayside. And sadly, many of us might not even know those bands then.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to ask me what my 3 top bands of all time are, it's probably Queen, AC/DC with Bon Scott, and also Soundgarden. Those 3 bands, if they came out today, they would have been dropped right away, and you would never have heard them ever again.
Now, what kind of impact, because I know you write about it a little bit in the book, the 82 to 2000 volume, what kind of impact do you think MTV had with music?
Oh, huge. In fact, so much that I did a earlier book called MTV Ruled the World, which I interviewed all the people from all the bands that were played around back in the early 80s on the channel, and I interviewed some of the VJs. But that was a clear change. Then suddenly you go from, not only do you have to write and sing good, you also have to look good. So now, like for instance, a band like Duran Duran, I didn't like at the time, but I actually have a lot of respect for them now because to the best of my knowledge, I think they wrote all their songs and they played it and everything. So although they were considered kind of pretty boys, and at the time, I'm sure you remember this too, if you were a heavy metal fan, Duran Duran was the complete enemy at the time.
Yes, that's true.
Whereas I'll be honest with you now, I'd much rather listen to Duran Duran than the majority of like all the 80s hair metal bands.
Okay, yeah. It's funny how that works, right?
Right, exactly. So so I mean, you cannot underestimate how huge MTV just shifted everything, at that point. I mean, Kiss could thank MTV for also saving their career too, because it was after they took off the makeup. After they took off their makeup, MTV totally embraced them and started playing their videos again.
True.
So
very true. No, I remember as a teenager, I didn't have MTV at home for a while. So I'd go to a friend's house on the weekend, a family friend's house, and I would just sit in front of MTV for hour after hour after hour and
Mhm.
get so excited with the videos. I mean, the kids today, and again, I don't mean to sound like an old fogey, but the kids today will not understand what that feeling was like. Because now you just go on YouTube and bang, you're watching
Right,
it. You know, Metallica released a new song and a new video yesterday at 10 o'clock. And by 10:01, everybody around the world was watching it, right?
right, yeah,
But that's not the way it was in the 80s. You had to sit there in front of TV, in front of MTV, just waiting. Oh, please play that new song. Oh, please play
right,
that new song, you know? So,
yeah,
and, you know, speaking of
exactly.
Metallica, I remember in the 80s, even when they released their one video, what a huge story that Metallica's doing their first
Yeah,
video, right?
I
So
remember it.
just such a different time.
I remember it was premiered on Headbangers Ball. I remember
Yep.
that. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh,
So
you
let
know,
me
I
ask, go ahead.
I was going to say right now, I'm just looking behind you. I finally noticed the Space Ace boots you have behind you.
Yes, I do. Yeah. Well, it's easier to identify the stuff in my background now because I'm redoing the room down here and I've been doing it for 3 months. So I
Oh,
haven't
okay.
hung up all the stuff on the wall. So now it's easy to see the guitars, the Space Ace boots back there. Exactly. But
Oh,
no,
you know
let
what?
me
And also, I have a very, very important question. Did you
go.
finally close your heated pool, or is it still open?
These are the important things that the viewers do need to know, right? Because definitely they may not read your book without knowing this answer. So, yeah. So for people who watch this, and Greg and I both live on Long Island here, so
Mm.
I love my swimming pool, and I did finally close it the like 2 days before I left for the Kiss cruise, and it
Ah.
saddened me. Because when I came back from the Kiss cruise, not only did it sadden me to close the pool, but it
Mm.
saddened me that when I came back for like 5 or 7 days, if you remember, on Long Island, it was like 70 degrees in November.
Yes, I
And I was
remember
like,
that.
my pool, if it was open, I'd be swimming. But no, it's officially closed. Stay tuned. The end of March, beginning of April, it'll be open again.
Now, be honest. Were you tempted to reopen it again just for those 5 days?
Oh yeah, I was, but you know, it was a little covered. The heater was off. I was like, nah, this
Yeah.
just it won't. But oh yeah, I was tempted. My wife's like, I dare you, peel back the cover and go in. I'm like, no, it's too cold. But you know, one of the things I love about going into the pool is that's kind of like my time. Believe it or not, that I sit out there, I put some music on, get some speakers out there, and
Mm.
that's when I do most of my music listening. So you didn't expect there to be a tie into the music conversation
Right,
when
there
you
you
asked
go.
me
All
that,
right.
but that's literally like I listened to the new Ozzy album out there for the first
Mm.
time, swimming in the pool. A lot of the
Right,
new albums that dropped this year, that's what I do. Hey, new album's out. Let me go in the pool, swim around a little bit, and blast it in the speakers. And my neighbors get to hear it too for free. Lucky them.
right,
You know,
right.
so,
Yeah.
so that's my thing. You know, let me add, I want to talk about your other, you know, iconic guitar gear book.
Yes.
But before we leave this, what I love, like I said before, is that all the different styles of music, all the different eras that you listen to music, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, which is your favorite decade of music?
Hmm. Oh, that's difficult. I mean, if I had to pinpoint it, probably probably late 91 through the end of 93, because just the amount of, it seemed like almost every month there was a classic landmark album coming out. And again, like I said, whether it be alternative, metal, pop, hip hop, they were putting their own unique spin on things. It was a weird time in music where you were actually celebrated, and also it transferred over to chart success if you're doing something unique and different.
Yep.
Which, I mean, the only other times I can think of that happening is maybe like the late 60s with like the psychedelic hippie type movement.
Yep.
If you think about, like, you know, Jimi Hendrix was different from the Doors, and the Doors was different from the Jefferson Airplane. Jefferson Airplane was different from Miles Davis, and Miles Davis was different from Iggy and the Stooges. So it's like all different stuff like that. I mean, you could also make the same argument. The mid to late 70s, you had Boston to the Sex Pistols to Kiss to Peter Frampton to Fleetwood Mac to, you know, like all these different things were happening. And then, but then by the same token, the you could say I loved also the early 80s with all, like, I loved Devo, I loved Joe Jackson, I loved what Van Halen was doing, the Creatures of the Night album, you know, Maiden. So
AC/DC had a few
yes,
classic
of
albums
course,
during
yeah,
that time,
yeah,
you know?
yeah, of course,
Yeah.
AC/DC. So, but if push came to shove, I probably have to go from late 91 through 1993 is my favorite, because just, yeah, Nevermind, Siamese Dream, Super Unknown. Actually, Super Unknown was 1994. So Bad, Motorfinger. Yeah, just so many classic albums at that point.
There is. And, you know, I love what you're saying with the different types of rock music that were around at that time, because even for myself, and probably viewers won't be into either of these two bands or albums that I mentioned, but like for myself at that time, I was very much into the Goo Goo Dolls, which
Mhm.
everybody ended up knowing as a pop rock band in
Right.
the mid 90s with Iris and Slide and all that. But before that, they were alternative rock bands. And I used to love like the Superstar Car Wash album, which came out like I think in 92 or 93.
Yeah.
And they were a very underground band at that time. I loved that. I loved the early No Doubt music, which was like very ska driven and Mighty Mighty Boss Tones and stuff like that. So no, I was into that type of stuff in the early mid 90s as well. So that was a great time to be a music fan. I agree.
Yep. I agree. I agree with you.
So there it is, A+ albums, volume 1 and volume 2, right? I do want to talk about because you have another book as well. That was it.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Show off the books one more time. Yes.
This is what they look like. And like, so these are available. It's available in paperback. It's also available in hardcover, also audio, and also Kindle. And again, paperback's only $14.99. I think this would make a great Christmas gift, right, Mike?
Hanukkah gift, Christmas gift,
Hanukkah,
New Year's
excuse me,
gift. If you have a birthday in December, if you just feel like taking care of a friend that you like, whatever the reason is, I can think of 100 reasons why for $14.99 somebody should literally stop watching this, go order them right now. Because we're only scraping the surface on some of the stuff that's in there.
And this is the other one, Iconic Guitar Gear. This came out earlier this year. And yeah, what it is, again, similar to the previous book, I knew that I've done a lot of interviews over the years for guitar publications, and I have a lot of renowned guitarists talking about their instruments. Also, the books I've done as well. I had a lot of people talking about the instruments that they played. Yep. So for this one, we go all the expected guitarists you would imagine are in this book, and a lot of them it's from that. You have Ace Frehley talking about his guitars. You have Brad Talinsky, who's written a great Van Halen book, him talking about Van Halen. You also have guitarists talking about Jimi Hendrix. We also have Michael Schenker talking about himself. And trying to think who else we have. We have Randy.
Oh, there's got to be over 100 guitarists in there, right?
Yeah, there are. Yeah, this is a big one. This is definitely a pretty thick book. And again, I was able to get some really cool, great rare pictures. This is Randy Rhoads. And then I have probably one of my favorite Eddie Van Halen photos ever. I'm going to show you. This one here, this bottom one.
Nice. Yep. Looks great. Yeah. I love it.
This is taken from 1980 at Nassau Coliseum. They played.
Oh, wow.
These big, yeah. But anyway, this is, I think, and also Jeff Beck. I'm looking at the back now. Brian May, Tony Iommi, Kurt Cobain, John Lennon, The Edge, Johnny Ramone, Yngwie Malmsteen, Steve Vai. They're all analyzed in this. And you don't have to be necessarily a guitar expert to get into this book because they talk a little bit, it's about guitars, but they also talk about like amps, effects, why they use the guitars. The whole story about how Eddie Van Halen came up with his stripe design is very interesting. And Brad Talinsky actually is able to pinpoint who Eddie may have ripped off for that. Ooh, may have.
We want to go read it in the book. Now, one things I'd like is, and you just rattled off a whole bunch of names there. Many obvious, maybe some people like The Edge. For some people might be like, really? The Edge and the guitars? But then you also have like, what's his name? Steve Jones from the Sex Pistols in there, which I think, to me, he doesn't get anywhere near the credit he deserves. We spoke about the album briefly before, but, he was probably the best musician in the band. I know Glenn, the original bassist, who also was in the guitarist book. So, let's pause there for a moment, right? The guitarists are not only guitarists, there's some bassists in there as well.
There are some bassists. We have Doug Pinnick from King's X. We have one of my favorite, most underrated bassists, Bill Gould from the band Faith No More. I love Faith No More. And the amount of bass lines they came up with that are classic, or at least classic to me, and also Faith No More fans, is definitely impressive. And he just had a very, there was a misconception back when I was younger that if you played bass with a pick, you weren't as good as if you played with fingers. But there are some exceptions to the rule, such as Chris Squire from Yes, John Entwistle from The Who played with both a pick and also his fingers. He would kind of like alternate. And also Bill Gould played primarily with a pick, but the way he would attack it is not just playing boring blah bass things. He would attack it very viciously and would do interesting like prog things, funk things, punk things, post-punk. It was a very interesting way that he played bass. So I was happy that I was able to speak to him for the book. And yeah, quite a few other bassists as well in the book called Iconic Guitar Gear.
That's right. And that's one of the things I liked about the book. And again, I'll just go back. I kind of tripped myself up over this, but you mentioned Steve Jones in the book. And to me, it's not only about the Eddie Van Halens or the Tony Iommis, who, there's no doubt belong in a book like this. But it's even some of those other guys. I'm picking out Steve Jones as an example that you highlight, and you highlight the gear and the guitars they work with. So I love you included guys like that in the book as well.
Right. Well, there's also a misconception that I sometimes talk about when I'm being interviewed that if you are technically fantastic at your instrument, if you could play super fast, that makes you a great guitarist. Whereas I go by the rule that I wouldn't want to hear Yngwie Malmsteen play a Nirvana song, and I wouldn't want to hear Kurt Cobain playing a Yngwie J. Malmsteen song. So it's whatever fits the song best. I'm a fan of. I interviewed Wolfgang Van Halen a year ago for the Song Facts site. And I told him, I said, I absolutely loved your father. There's no denying that he revolutionized guitar with soloing and everything. But to me, the thing that I love the most about your father's playing was his rhythm, and also was his rhythm guitar work, and also songwriting. And he totally 100% said I was right on the money with that. He said he totally agrees with me that that's his favorite stuff with his father, was his songwriting and also just riff writing and also rhythm work.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100% there. It's not only about, if it was only about how many notes per second you could play, somebody like Yngwie that you mentioned before would be the number one guitarist that rolls off of people's mouths, right? But it's not only about that. And that's no disrespect to Yngwie, who could play guitar a million times better than I'm ever going to play it, right? But sometimes it's a lot more than just a million notes a second.
That's also what I've noticed too. Today we're talking about how with rock and metal bands sound all the same. Now it seems like we're also back with the shredder guitar players. It's just most of these are just playing so fast. But the thing, you think back to Steve Vai and also Joe Satriani, while they could play fast, their early solo albums especially, I thought, had very solid songwriting. Like the songs you could actually, like the song Always With Me, Always With You by Joe Satriani, you could actually sing along to the melody. It's not all just him shredding away. Same with also Steve Vai. My favorites, a lot of people point to Passion and Warfare as Steve Vai's favorite solo album. Mine personally is an album called Flexible, which is very Frank Zappa-ish. And he has some great songs on that. A song called the Attitude Song is probably the best known song on that. And that's just a very simple riff, just do, 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 just over and over again. But then he does a solo, which is fantastic. But that is all I'm going to say about that.
That's awesome. One other guitarist I want to highlight that you had in the book, which I was glad to see, because again, my opinion, he doesn't get anywhere near the just due, is Brad Gillis, right? Yes. So many people think of Night Ranger and the power ballads from the 80s, but Night Ranger was a great 2-guitar band that had a lot of rock songs. And, Brad was on Speak of the Devil with Ozzy, and I think he friggin' not Speak of the Devil. Did I say Shut Up the Devil? Well, whatever. Speak of the Devil. Yeah, he nailed those Sabbath songs to the point that when I interviewed Brad once a couple of years ago, and he looked at me like I was nuts when I said what I'm about to say, but I think some of those versions are the definitive versions. Symptom of the Universe on that Speak the Devil album is freaking phenomenal, and his guitar tone is phenomenal. And to me, he does not get the credit he deserves. And I was so happy you included him in the book.
Yeah, I agree with you, because the first Ozzy album I ever owned was of course that Speak of the Devil album we just talked about. And I actually have a cousin who he was also really into metal at the time. He still is, and he even said something similar to you, that in his mind he associates those versions of the Black Sabbath songs sometimes with what Brad Gillis is playing, because he heard those versions so much at the time. And just the fact that also again, talking about guitarists putting their own unique spin, Brad Gillis was doing a thing with the whammy bar called the whammy bar flutter, or the cricket, he called it. It's kind of hard to explain what it is, but if you take a whammy bar and just kind of hit the back of it, it makes a weird vibrating sound that doesn't sound like just a regular kind. It doesn't sound anything like a Eddie Van Halen dive bomb or anything like that. And I interviewed him for the Guitar World website, and I also interviewed him for this book, Iconic Guitar Gear, and he talks about that and how he also came up with that whole cricket guitar flutter thing.
Yeah, no, great guitarist. Is there anybody through the years that you say, this would be my number one get that I want to interview, and you haven't been able to get yet?
Let me think about that. Howard Stern, maybe?
Wow, okay, that's an interesting answer.
or else let me think of some. I mean, I've never interviewed James Hetfield. That would be pretty cool. The only original Kiss member I've never interviewed is Gene Simmons. So that would be good to interview him, just to say I've interviewed all 4 original Kiss members. I think who else? I would have loved to have interviewed Eddie Van Halen, but sadly that's too late.
Yep.
Would you believe Lou Reed? I would have loved to have interviewed because I'm a huge Velvet Underground fan. I also like a lot of Lou Reed's solo stuff. I do not like Lulu. I thought that was horrible. But
I think most people will agree with you there.
yeah. But just I see old interviews with Lou Reed, and some people I think get the misconception that he was very caustic and not very nice and very moody and kind of mean. But if you see, like, there's some really great interviews from him in the early 70s where he just rips the interviewers apart. And it's not so much because he's being a dick, it's because the interviewers are just like jerks. They're either not prepared or they're just asking stupid questions, So like I would have liked to have done a either face-to-face interview with him or even like over the phone. And just I think if he could understand that I was a big fan of his music and ask decent questions, not these idiotic questions, I think it would have been a pretty cool interview. I would have been happy to say that I interviewed Lou Reed, but I was also I was happy that I interviewed John Lydon. That was a very good
So I was
interview.
just going to ask you about that because he'd probably be my number one, although it might scare the shit out of me to interview him because you never know what you're going to get with him.
See, I'm going to tell you, there's been times where I go into an interview thing at the person because of what I've heard about them, that they're going to be jerks. But Lemmy from Motorhead couldn't have been a sweeter, nicer guy. I interviewed him about 4 or 5 times over the years. And I even told him that once. I said, you have this aura about you or this thing about you that you're very intimidating, but all the times I've interviewed you, you couldn't have been nicer. And he said, thanks, So that was nice. The same with also John Lydon. Again, I think it was because I was asking, like, I'm a huge fan. Besides just the Sex Pistols, I really like the early Pill albums.
Okay, yeah.
Because I give him a lot of credit too, that he could have very easily just done Sex Pistols Part 2 and he would have probably become huge, commercially. But instead he did very experimental stuff with Pill. And he did an album, I think it's in 1985, called Album, and he had Steve Vai on it and also several other people. He had Ginger Baker and he had several other pretty big name people play on it. And to me, that's one of his best albums. From beginning to end, it's one of the most original, consistent albums he's ever done. Steve Vai's playing is great on it. It's not shredding. He's playing in a very unique, strange way. And I even, one of the things I asked him during the interview was like, did that lineup ever come close to touring? And I think he said there were plans, but they just couldn't get it because I think that was right around the time that Steve Vai hooked up with David Lee Roth.
Right. That's what I was thinking as you're talking. Yep.
Yeah. So that just killed it. But that would have been interesting to see what they would have gone on to do if they stayed together longer. But that said, I still do love the whole David Lee Roth, Eat 'em and Smile album. And that tour that the Eat 'em and Smile tour at Nassau Coliseum, January 1987, remains possibly the best arena show that I've ever seen to this day.
Really?
Possibly, yeah.
Was it because of the musicianship? I mean, the band is incredible.
I was really super into Steve Vai at the time, but just it almost felt like from the time you entered the arena to the time you left, it was just an unforgettable, just everything about it. And just the band was phenomenal. The set list was great. I was such a huge fan of the whole Eat 'em and Smile album. There was also maybe a little extra energy to it, or a little extra venom to it, because there was that whole Sammy Hagar verse, like David Lee Roth thing going on at the time. So there was a clear line drawn in the sand, and it seemed like everyone there knew that David Lee Roth was like, the man. And he was doing
some classic Van Halen songs as well.
Yeah. And they also did a great job with that. And then, the thing is, like, there's that funny joke people say that, like, whenever there's a bass solo or a guitar solo, that's the time everyone goes up and goes to the bathroom. That was they're smart. What they did is David Lee Roth sat down Steve Vai and also Billy Sheehan, and he had them do what they were going to do, when they were doing rehearsals. And he says, "Nah, this is going to put people to sleep. This is what you got to do. Is you got to do like a battle." And he helped them choreograph, put together this whole thing that today, if you could find this on YouTube, it's actually worth seeing because they have some bootlegs where they're like going back and forth. But not only that, they're like chasing each other back and forth at the whole stage. And then at one point they're like holding their guitars up. It was very entertaining. You didn't have to be a big guitar aficionado to, I think, get a pretty big kick out of what they were doing. So that still to me is one of my favorite arena shows.
I remember, I want to say, sure, you said that was January of 87?
Yeah, Tesla was opening up.
Tesla. Okay, yeah, I feel like I saw that tour in October of 86 at the Garden with Cinderella, right?
I had.
I'm doing this off the top of my head, so forgive me if that's wrong, but I think that's right.
And that would have been with Cinderella opening up, right?
Cinderella, correct.
Yeah,
Yep.
yep. That was October. And that one I did not go to because that was before I started going to like shows off Long Island. So yeah, that one I didn't
Right.
go to, but
Okay,
I
yeah,
did go to
no,
the Nassau show, which was great.
and I just remember that stage being probably the most colorful stage
Mm.
I'd seen in my life.
Yeah.
And Dave was very flamboyant with the color
Yeah.
outfits that he was
Right.
wearing. So
Yeah.
the show probably would fall in maybe in my top 15 concerts ever.
Yeah.
My number one concert, I always say, is the Sex Pistols 1996 Roseland Ballroom.
I regret not seeing them on that whole reunion tour because I have friends that saw either that or saw them play Jones Beach, and they said that they were great. Yeah,
I'll say this to you, Greg. The 96 show was my number one concert, I think, ever. The energy in that room. And this was literally like, I think, a week or two after seeing Kiss reunited at the Garden. And I went 4 nights at the Garden.
Yeah.
And I still say the Sex Pistols 10 days later or so was better than those Kiss shows. And I'm a lifelong Kiss fan, right? But the energy in that room at Roseland that night was just unlike anything I've ever seen before. Fast forward to whatever it was, 2003 or 4 when they did Jones Beach. Maybe one of my bottom 5 concerts I've ever seen in my life. Right. It was just, to me, it was total opposite. First off, Sex Pistols at the beach just doesn't fit to me at all. It's like the wrong vibe. It was a cool night, the wind blowing off the water. It was a beautiful night for a concert, but not for a Sex Pistols concert. It was just like, I was down like, this just feels all wrong. So whatever, that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, because the thing too, probably why I also enjoyed that David Lee Roth show so much is that to me, it showed that David Lee Roth pulled off the near impossible and put together a band that was as good or as close to being as good as Van Halen, which sadly, because he has such a problem with his ego, he just blew up that band. And that album Skyscraper, I mean, I liked it a bit at the time, but I never listened to that album anymore.
No, last summer, my friend and I listened to Hot Dog and a Shake just as a joke because we haven't listened to it in 20, 30 years, but that album does nothing for me at all.
I mean, I interviewed Billy Sheehan for an earlier book I did called Shredders, which I interviewed all the Shredder guitarists from the 80s. And I told him that. I said, it's just such a shame as a fan for me. I really would have loved to have seen that Eat 'em and Smile band stay together and continue in that direction. And he said, his quote was, if they stayed together and if they continued on in that direction, about 1 or 2 years later, I think the quote was that they would have ultimately crushed Van Halen.
Look, I was a Sammy Van Halen guy, and I like Dave and Van Halen also. I never choose sides. I like both. There could be a case for that. That's how strong the Eat 'em and Smile album was and the tour. And I mean, I can't argue with that. That's certainly a possibility. And that's no disrespect to Van Halen with Sammy, because again, I love those albums. I happen to think For Unlawful Common Knowledge is an incredible album. Saw them on tour with Alice in Chains, in 91. So but I could agree with Billy is that's a possibility. If only. We'll never know, unfortunately.
We'll never know, sadly.
Just going back to your iconic Guitar Gear book for a moment. Is there any guitarists that you wish that you put in the book that you had to leave out for whatever reason?
Yeah, I would have liked to have included David Gilmour from Pink Floyd, but I sadly never interviewed him, and and then it got to the point too. This book is, let's see how long this is. This is a pretty big book. It's where's the page? 275 pages, and that's not including the photo section in the middle, and there's like 30 pictures in the middle, so it's close to like 300 pages. So it got to the point that I was going to start probably like losing money if I added more to this book. So I sadly did not include David Gilmour, who's one of my favorite guitarists. But again, I never interviewed him, and I didn't have anyone that I could like reach out to get any kind of insight on him. So he, I think, is probably at the top of the list. But I mean, you could say George Harrison would have been good, but I did get pretty lengthy things about John Lennon, because I put out a book a few years back called John Winston Ono Lennon, which I have people talking about everything about John Lennon. That album, that book came out to tie in with the 40-year anniversary or 40-year marking of John Lennon's passing, which was in December 2020.
Yep.
So for that book, I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Brian Kehew, who did a very extensive Beatles book a while back. He's a Beatles fanatic. He knows everything about their recording techniques and everything. And he was a member of the band called Moog Cookbook. I don't know if you remember that band.
No, I do not.
In the 90s. All right, yeah. So he's a, you could say, gear nerd. He knows everything about instruments and everything. Yeah. So he had some really cool things to say about the Beatles and also their gear for that. So I was able to at
Well,
least include that.
that's one of the things I love about both of these books. Oh, I guess I should say all three of the books, right? Because the A plus albums is 2 volumes. Is
Yes.
that it would be easy for anybody to write a book to just give opinions, right? But like you said throughout this entire chat, you've got interviews with the musicians, with people who knew them, whatever it is, friends of the musicians, other musicians talking about the musicians, whatever it is, that really, to me, enhance the reader experience in all three of these books and really throughout your books. Like, and we spoke about at the top, the Eric Carr book and the Kiss book a little bit. And, that Eric Carr book is littered with people talking about him. And, and I say littered in a great way, it's tons of different interviews. And that's the way it is in these books as well. It's not just Greg giving his opinion on what the best albums are from the 70 to 82 or who the best iconic guitar players are and what gear they use. You've got it straight from the horse's mouth or from people who knew the horse, so to speak.
Right.
So.
Now, would you believe in the Eric Carr story? Michael James Jackson said he firmly thinks Ace Frehley did play a bit on the Creatures album. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I've heard Michael did say that. Then he backtracked off of that a few years later. I'll say this. I happen to think Michael James Jackson was, I know people are going to disagree with this, possibly the best Kiss producer there was, right? Better than Ezrin, maybe even better than Eddie Kramer. I just think the Creatures of the Night and the Lick It Up album and even Kiss Killers sounds great. Saying that, his memory isn't the best, unfortunately. Right, yeah. So I don't believe Ace is on those songs at all. Not at all. In fact, Gene just recently did an interview and he said Ace didn't play a note. I don't always believe what Gene says either, because his memory, he was living it. He wasn't documenting it the way people like us like to. But I don't think Ace is on the album at all, and I think Michael just misspoke.
But now let me ask you this: which albums do you think I got right in these 2 volumes?
Oh boy, I love that there's a lot. Right? There's what over 100 albums listed in the 2 albums, right? In the 2.
Oh yeah,
books.
well, you know what? Let me interrupt. I'm gonna tell your listeners a little a small secret. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. It's actually more than 100 because I put some bonuses at the end. So you have.
That's why I said, is it more than 100? Because I thought there was more. Okay. Yes.
Exactly. So, but just.
Yes, of course. Yeah. I'll say this, and I mentioned this at the top. You were saying what you get right. Look, there's always going to be different opinions, right? Of what's an A+ album, what's not an A+ album. And I could sit here and again, people think I'm nuts. To me, Survive of Vital Signs is an A+ album. I would never expect it to make your book, right? Okay, so I just know that for me, that's just like one of the most perfect pop albums there is. I've also in the '80s grew up, and I love saying this to people. In the early '80s, I would listen to Number of the Beast, finish that album, put on Like a Virgin from Madonna, which is not typical for a teenager in the '80s. As you remember, usually it was very divided, the types of music. But I saw Madonna on the Like a Virgin tour in 1985, and I saw Kiss the following month if they came to town. That's just the way it was for me. What I loved about the books, and where I think you got it right, and is the starting point more than anything. The first album listed in the first book, Black Sabbath. And it's like, you can't, that to me is the perfect start when you're talking about rock. Of course, I'm not minimizing what the Beatles meant and what Elvis meant. No way would I minimize that. But for me, that's like the start of heavy metal right there. And that's where you start the book. And at that moment, I read that and I'm like, well, I'm going to disagree with some things in here. I know I'm going to agree with stuff in here. I'm already roped in just from the first album. And that's what I loved about it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. Did you have the guts to wear a Kiss Animalized tour shirt to a Madonna concert?
That's a great question. No, I have a picture of myself at the concert that night, and I wore this button-down, colorful shirts and a red tank top underneath it with the buttons, undone on the shirt. No, I did not wear my Animalized shirt. I should have. That would have been interesting, but no, I did not.
Now, let me ask you also a second question. What was the male to female ratio at that Madonna concert?
99 to 1. I might have been the only guy there that night.
I was going to say that, that shows you're a very smart man, because if you went there trying to meet a girl, you probably, your chances increase very, very high, right?
Absolutely. And you know what? I'll tell you very true. I'll tell you a funny thing about that show. It was at Radio City, July 15th, I think, of 85, right around mid-July. And the opening act for that show was the Beastie Boys. Oh, sorry. Yes. It was the Beastie Boys. And they got booed
Yeah.
And if I turned to people I was with, and I was like, well, there's a band we'll never hear from again. Shows what I know, you know. But I've never seen that at a concert before where somebody, the opening act, got booed so badly. But to their credit, they just kept on going. They're like, you're going to
Yeah.
boo us and we're going to keep on playing.
Yeah.
You
That's
know,
funny.
so
That's
but
funny.
yeah, so to me there's a lot to like about the books. I love reading books like this, you know, A+ albums, because I love reading it and saying, gee, you've got a King's X album in there. I don't know that I agree with that. It's good, but A+, and I'm not really, not in my.
Mm.
But then I was like, but that's my opinion, you know.
Right.
And I'll
Yeah.
say this, and you mentioned this early on in our chat, and again, I'm going to get crucified for this. I shouldn't say it, but I will.
Mhm.
Hotel California is a good song. I like the first couple of songs on the album. It's okay, whatever. I've never really attached myself to it, but I'd sound like a jerk if I didn't say that that doesn't belong to be on an A+ album list. It's just my personal preference. I don't love it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that album, if you listen to it from beginning to end, isn't like my personal favorite. I mean, you could say the title track is great. You could say Life in the Fast Lane is great.
Yep.
You could say Victim of Love, I believe is the name of the song. It's first song on side 2. That's a great song. Then after that, it's like I never really cared for that Pretty Maids All in a Row song with the symphony, and I'm not really into that whole thing. But I was going to ask your opinion. What do you think of me going with Queen 2 instead of A Night at the Opera? That's a little controversial, isn't it?
Yeah, you know, but again, that's one of the things I like about the book is you didn't always take the easy route in some of this. And you know, look, I said this at the top. No matter who you're talking to, people are going to have different opinions, right? And that's all fine and good. I love that though you back up your selections with comments from the artist or from other artists or whatever. So otherwise, it's just Greg's 100 favorite albums, you know, 100 plus favorite albums, you know. But you back it up. So, and I love that you go out of the box like that. Sometimes, to me, that's what makes it a fun read. If you sat there and you say, well, before I open up the book, I'm going to write down what 100 albums I'm going to read about right now, and then you open the book and it's those 100 albums, that's kind of boring to me.
Right.
I don't have to agree with every selection. That's not what it's about. It's about listening and then really taking a step back as myself and say, do I agree with what he just wrote? Do I disagree? You know, that to me is part of the fun of reading some of books like this. So I like them when you go out of the box a little bit sometimes.
Right. Yeah, and
just
also like something that I think you said earlier, which is true. It's interesting to look at just the list and you read it, how much music changed from 1970 through 1982, and then looking from 1982 through, of course, 2000. That it's interesting to see how much it changed. You know, if you look at it from like that type of perspective.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things I loved is going through the books and saying, I don't know if I ever, and I can't think of one of them off the top of my head, but I'm like, I don't know if I ever listened to that album front to back that you.
You know, I was going to ask you. You said you're a very big fan of pop and power pop. Are you familiar with the album "Spilt Milk" by the band Jellyfish?
I know who Jellyfish is. I honestly will say I've never listened to them.
You have to listen to that album. They put out 2 albums. They broke up. The first album I don't really care for. The second album, it's like Beatles, Supertramp, Queen, but just the songs and the melodies and the harmonies. It's just crazy how great it is, and it's still to this day I don't understand how that album wasn't a huge massive hit. But if you like pop type stuff and power pop and that type of thing, I would highly recommend. And it's in the second volume.
Yep.
Spilt Milk by.
And that's exactly so. Now, after this is done over the next couple of days, I'm going to make sure I listen to that. And that's what I like about books like this, is that it makes you think. If it was just Mike Brunn's personal favorite 100 albums and Greg agrees with him, well, that's freaking boring. You know, I'm sorry. And to me, there's never a right or wrong answer with this. So I like when there's some of those curveballs in there. And that's why, to me, I'm recommending to my viewers and listeners, check these books out for $14.99. Like I said, you're going to buy a pizza tomorrow. It's going to cost you more money than this. And then you're going to crap it out at the end and have nothing to show for it. Here, you'll have a book that you can kind of read and kind of talk about with friends. And for $14.99, you can't go wrong.
And also for the holiday season, we have to stress that, right?
That's right. That's right. The holidays are here. Like I said, I don't care. Christmas, Hanukkah, if you have a birthday in December, if you just like a friend and you want to give them a book or whatever the reason is, this is a steal. Great. You're giving it away at $14.99. You should make it $20.99. No, it's a steal. And I've read through the book and it's great. It's worth every penny. Talk about where everybody could find the books, whether it's the A+ books, your other books, your older books, the iconic Guitar Gear books. Where can people find them?
You can find all my books on Amazon.com. Just do a search for Greg Prato and you'll see all my books there. And of course, you can go to Twitter. I'm at twitter.com/Greg Prato Writer. That's GregPrato and then writer. there I post all my latest interviews. Today was an interesting thing. I totally forgot, Ronnie James Dio back in 2006. I interviewed him for Classic Rock magazine. And the thing was for him to discuss his favorite album of all time. And he picked Sgt. Pepper. And he talked about it. It was actually very interesting what was going on with his like life at the time and what his favorite songs are. It's not the expected songs you'd think off that album.
Yep.
It was very interesting. So yeah, that I just posted a link to today on Twitter. And I also just posted recently the links to my latest interviews, which have been Mick Box from Uriah Heep, David Crosby from Crosby, Stills, Nash, Dave Mustaine from Megadeth, a singer from a band called Ginger. It's like a newish kind of heavy metal band. I interviewed the singer for that band. And a few other interviews too. I can't think off the top of my head, but yeah, I always post my latest interview.
Well, every day you see the guitarist in this band. I just got off the phone with him. You see the singer in this band. I see your post. I'm like, holy crap! You got that person. You got this. You know, you're nonstop on this.
Yes. Yeah, I have. And I'm trying to work out an interview early next year. It's not definite, but I'm in the talking stages. Bryan Adams.
Oh, that would be awesome. Love Bryan Adams.
Hopefully I get that. He's actually someone that I've never interviewed that I would definitely like to enjoy.
Look, it goes back to what I was saying in the 80s, and I know he was pop and rock, but you know, that what was it, Reckless album is called? Friggin' one of the greatest albums of the 80s, in my opinion. You know, that's so yeah, I'm looking forward. I hope you get him. That would be a great get.
So now I know you did a whole episode about this, but just in two or three sentences.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on the Creatures box set?
Oh, I absolutely love it. You know, what did I say earlier on when the album first came out? I wasn't into it in '82. I've since come around. I still think it might be ever so slightly overrated by fans who sometimes say it's the #1 Kiss album. I put it top 10, but not #1. But I think they hit a home run with this box set. You know, to me, I love the fact that there's tons of demos in there, many of which we had never heard before. I know some people complain the live stuff doesn't sound picture perfect. It was never intended for an official release, these recordings. I love that we have recordings from the Creatures of the Night, tour. They hit a home run with this box set. I bought the physical product. I love the stuff they included inside is great. The only fault I could find with it, and I said this when I did my review of it, is it leaves me wondering what else did they have that's not. And when I see like Saint and Sinner take 11, my mind goes to, I want to hear takes 1 through 10 also, and it's not on here, because I'm just a nut like that. So that's my only complaint, is that it just leaves me wanting even more. But I think they hit a home run. What about you? Did you get it?
I have listened to it on Spotify, but I'm I'm going to be getting a copy because I got the okay to review it for the Brave Word site. So I'm going to be posting so I'll be able to check it out. But I've seen pictures of what's included, and it looks absolutely great. And I was going to say, in this book, there's a whole chapter that we analyzed Creatures of the Night. I interviewed Michael James Jackson, several other people that were part of the creation of that album. So there's a whole chapter in this about Creatures of the Night. So this would go perfect with that, I think.
Absolutely. And that's another one that's, I'm sure, available on Amazon right now, that if Kiss fans don't have it, they can go and order it, right?
And now, although this is about the non-makeup era, I'm going to let you explain quickly why Creatures of the Night is included in this. Mike, go ahead. Explain.
Oh, I don't remember why. Now you're putting me on the spot.
Because remember in 1985, they reissued.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They had the reissue,
cover,
right? Oh, how could I forget that? Oh, I hang my head in shame. I'm sorry. Oh, man, of course they did. And Bruce Kulick's on the cover, and he's not on the album. And they remixed a couple of songs on it. Yes, of course. And you have a whole chapter on that. I totally remember, but you put me on the spot and I froze. Damn.
And also on the back cover of the original is Thunder and Lightning, and on the back cover of the non-makeup cover is a picture of someone's tuchus.
Yes, and it's not Paul Stanley's. But going back to the Eric Carr book for a moment, one of the things I love, and I bought that book years ago, is Eric was always my guy growing up as a Kiss fan in the 80s. And but you peel back the onion a little bit on this and what it was really like for him in Kiss in the 80s. And I'll say some of the demons that he had to face in being in the band and maybe not getting the respect from Paul and Gene that maybe he felt he deserved. And that's one of the things I loved about that book. It was just such a eye-opening read, especially for at the time when the book came out. There's like, oh, there's some of this stuff in here I just never knew. And I bet you Kiss fans, if you didn't buy the book yet, there's going to be things that you learn in there that you didn't know.
I was lucky to get, to the best of my knowledge, Bill Aucoin's last ever interview for that book. I
Wow.
interviewed him just like a few months before he passed away, and I had obviously no
Of course.
knowledge that he was ill, but yeah, he had some great things to say. Yeah, there were definitely some really cool things that were said. Yeah, I interviewed also Eddie Trunk for the book, who I know some people love Eddie Trunk, some people have a problem with him with his opinions, but he was a close personal friend of Eric, so he has some really
Absolutely.
interesting things to say. And Eric would even confide in him some things that were going on behind the scene, which again, it's some of the things are sad, some of the things are kind of like food for thought type things. But I think Kiss fans will definitely enjoy that book.
Agreed. And if speaking of drummers, you also put out a book, I think in the last year or right around a year ago, Bonzo as well, right?
Bonzo, correct? Yeah. What happened was when we hit 2020, besides of course that year just sucking, that was also the year that it was the anniversary of a lot of, or I keep saying anniversary, but it was the marking. You don't want to say an anniversary of someone dying. The marking of all these like legendary people passing away. It was 40 years that Bon Scott died. So I did a book about Bon Scott that came out around February. Jimi Hendrix, it was 50 years that he died. I did a book about Jimi Hendrix that came out in around September. And then also John Bonham died 40 years. So that came out in September. And then in December, it was John Lennon. That was 40 years. So somehow I did 4 books in 2020.
Which is amazing. I can't imagine.
Well, you know what? Actually, now I'm thinking back because a lot of people had nothing to do in 2020. We're all in our houses in 2020. So I had a lot of time on my hands to do books.
Well, you put your time to good use, obviously.
Yeah. You know what? Let me think. You know what? Right now, we're going to play a very, very quick game. I'm going to see if I can remember the names of all 4 of those books without looking at them. You ready?
Go ahead.
All right. The Bon Scott one was called A Rock and Rollin' Man. That was the Bon Scott one. The Jimi Hendrix one was called Avatar of the Electric Guitar. Bonham was just called Bonzo. And John Lennon was called, John Lennon was called John Winston Ono Lennon.
Right.
I did it.
You did it. Yay.
I was going to say, can I please get a round of applause?
Yeah, there you go. And you can get all of those plus the other Amazon. 30 plus on Amazon, right?
Yeah, and the majority of my books, like I said, are available in hardcover, paperback, Kindle, and a lot of them I also have audio version with me narrating. And like we talked about before, besides music, I also have some sports books. So it's a little bit for everybody that I've done.
Absolutely. And look, we'll wrap this up in a moment here, but I also gave you your idea for your first book in 2023, the D+ albums. I expect to see that on the shelf next year. So.
I like that.
Do you have any plans for other books?
Yeah, actually, I have a book coming out sometime next year. It's going to be a book of lists, rock lists, because similar to these other books, I've realized I've done a lot of lists over the years for sites and magazines. But I don't want to just do a book just of a compilation. So I also came up with some new things as well. So awesome. I have some of those. Like I can tell you some of the lists I came up with were the top 10 times a opening band blew away the headliner.
Nice, I like that. I like that.
That was one of them. And you know what? I'm going to give you one taste of one of the people on that. And it's not so much that the opener blew away the headliner, but I know the opener or at least surprised people. And that was when Rush opened up for Kiss in 1975, 76. Sure. Because I mean, there was no blowing away Kiss at that point because they were at the height,
But Rush gave them a run for their money.
Right, exactly. But right. And then also you could say, and then the only other time that I remember ever it pretty much being unanimous that an opening band blew away the headline from everyone I spoke to was Metallica on the Master of Puppets tour opening up for Ozzy. Everyone that went to that show, they played Nassau Coliseum, I think in March or I think it was April of '86. It was like everyone was converted into being a huge Metallica fan after seeing that.
Yep.
I sadly didn't go to that, but
no, me neither. I've seen pictures. I know fans who've gone. Yeah. I actually, and that's a great call out. I thought you might have been mentioning at first Van Halen opening up for Black Sabbath.
Maybe that's included too.
Maybe it is. We're going to have to wait and see. Awesome. Well, once again, Greg, why don't you just tell people where to find you on Twitter, where to find the books? Why don't you show off the books one more time?
Oh, yeah, sure. These are the A+ albums, and again, if you get the hardcover is pricier, but you can make that's like a nice like a coffee table type thing you just leave on your coffee table. And also, like we were saying before, I mean, if you're not, there's going to be a lot of albums that but there's going to be things you're going to learn about that you don't know, and also albums you don't know about after you read about them. I have a feeling you'll want to check them out.
Absolutely. So, and then the iconic guitar gear.
We have iconic guitar gear right here. We have Eddie Van Halen,
Yep.
the great Eddie Van Halen. And then we talked about if you're a Kiss fan, why not check out my 2 Kiss books, which is Take It Off, Kiss Truly Unmasked, and we have the Eric Carr story.
Absolutely. And I'll just say this also, you've been on the show before. We spoke about the Kiss the Unmasked book. We spoke about the Eric Carr book. So guys who are watching and listening to this, you can check those out. But there's really no reason to check them out. Just go buy the books if you don't have them, because they're great books. To me, one of the things I love through this whole conversation, you can just hear coming out of you and through this whole conversation, your love for all the music, right? And that just kind of comes through the entire time. There's never any part of this conversation where I'm like, well, you're just writing another book just to make $1 or $2 on this. It's clear. It's a passion. It's a love. And it comes through in the books as well. And then that's, to me, one of the things that make your book so great.
Yeah, today through Spotify, at the end of the year, you get like a thing from Spotify telling you your top albums or top bands, whatever. And it said, I listen to music like more than 93% of what the average Spotify listener listens.
Wow. Wow, that's good. See, I don't even know if I got anything from Spotify, because I hate to say it, I don't use Spotify to listen to music.
Yeah.
I've got, 20,000 songs, and I still call it iTunes. I don't know what it's, Apple Music, whatever it's called.
Apple, yes. Yeah, something like
and
that.
I listen in there to my music, and then I'll read a book like yours. I'm like, good, that's good. Let me go download that album and check that out, or stream it on there. So maybe I got to start going to Spotify as well, because I'd probably be in the bottom 1% on Spotify if people listen to music, which wouldn't be true, but I just don't use Spotify. But anyway, Where do people find you on Twitter again?
Twitter.com/Greg Prato Writer. And I'm also on, you could find me on also Instagram, but my shtick on Instagram is I post pictures that do not show my face. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
Okay, that's interesting. All righty. Well, like we said, this is the start of the holiday season here. I think you've given us 30 plus ideas for different holiday gifts for friends, especially though the A+ albums, volume 1 and volume 2, especially the iconic guitar gear book. But don't just stop there. Pick up some of the other ones. There's some great sports books, some other great music books. Greg, I want to thank you so much for joining me. This was, I think I could do this for a couple of hours just talking music, because this is a lot of fun, just talking about all the different bands we grew up loving and all the bands of music that we listen to. But thank you so much for joining me.
Yes, thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on again.
Awesome. Now, hopefully everybody went and bought those books before you listen to the end of this. Everybody, thanks for watching as always. Check out Greg's stuff on Amazon. Until next time, thank you, everybody. Alrighty, there you have it. I'd like to thank Greg for joining me again, talking all about his latest books, iconic guitar gear, and A+ albums. As you guys heard, at $14.99, this is a steal. You definitely want to pick this up for yourself or for somebody you know during this great holiday time period. It makes a perfect gift, and I can tell you guys, you're going to really love these books. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button below. If you're listening to one of my podcasts, subscribe over there as well. Also, head on over to Facebook and follow my page, The Rock Experience with Mike Brunn, where each and every day we talk about all the rock and roll music that you love. You could also follow me on Instagram and Twitter as well. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. See you all next time.